The Palace of Versailles, the golden prison that destroyed a kingdom. Welcome. Today, I am going to tell you a story that will make you question everything you think you know about luxury and power. You might have heard about the Palace of Versailles before. Maybe you know it as the ultimate symbol of royal extravagance, a magnificent chateau with golden gates and breathtaking gardens. Or perhaps you've seen it in movies and photographs as the most beautiful palace in the world. But today, I am going to tell you the real story, the story that most people never hear, the story of how one king's obsession with building the perfect palace led to the destruction of an entire monarchy. The Palace of Versailles is not just a building, it is a monument to absolute power, unimaginable wealth, and the dangerous illusion that luxury can solve political problems. This is the story of King Louis XIV, the Sun King, who transformed a small hunting lodge into the most magnificent palace on earth. This is the story of how he used Versailles as a weapon to control the most dangerous people in France, the nobility. And this is the story of how his great-great-great-grandson, Louis XVI, and his wife, Marie Antoinette, paid the ultimate price for living in a golden cage while their people starved. After listening to this, you will be shocked to know how much money was spent on Versailles, how the palace became a prison for thousands of nobles, how Marie Antoinette was blamed for bankrupting France, and how this beautiful palace ultimately led to one of the bloodiest revolutions in human history. This is not just a history lesson. This is a perfect story for your English listening practice. So sit back, relax, and let me take you on a journey through 3 centuries of power, luxury, betrayal, and bloodshed. Now, let's begin. The boy king who would become the sun. To understand the Palace of Versailles, we must go back in time to the year 1638. Imagine France in turmoil. The country had been without a royal heir for 23 years. King Louis XIII and his wife, Anne of Austria, had been married for decades but had no children. The future of the French monarchy was in doubt. People whispered that God had cursed the royal family. And then, on September 5, 1638, a miracle happened. After 23 years of marriage, Queen Anne gave birth to a son. They named him Louis, Louis Dieudonné, Louis the God-given. The entire country celebrated. Bells rang in every church. People danced in the streets. France finally had an heir. But young Louis would not have an easy childhood. When he was only 4 years old, his father, King Louis XIII, died. Louis became King Louis XIV at the age of 4, a child king. But of course, a 4-year-old cannot rule a country, so his mother, Anne of Austria, became regent, and she appointed Cardinal Mazarin, a cunning Italian politician, as chief minister. But France was not at peace. The nobility, the powerful dukes and princes who owned vast estates across France, were hungry for power. They saw a child king and a foreign regent as weakness, and so they rebelled. This rebellion was called the Fronde, and it lasted from 1648 to 1653. It was a civil war between the monarchy and the nobility. Paris became a battlefield. Mobs rioted in the streets. The royal family was forced to flee the palace in the middle of the night. Young Louis, only 10 years old, experienced something that would change him forever. One night, an angry mob broke into the royal palace. They wanted to see if the king was still there or if he had escaped. Louis, terrified, pretended to be asleep in his bed while the mob surrounded him. He could hear them breathing, smell their sweat, feel their eyes on him. The mob finally left, satisfied that the king was still in Paris. But Louis never forgot that moment. He never forgot the terror of being powerless. He never forgot the humiliation of being at the mercy of the nobility. When the Fronde finally ended in 1653, Louis made a vow. He would never be weak again. He would never allow the nobility to threaten the crown again, and he would find a way to control them, to dominate them, to make them powerless. This vow would lead to the creation of Versailles. In 1661, Cardinal Mazarin died. Louis XIV was now 22 years old, and he did something that shocked everyone. He announced that he would rule France himself. No chief minister, no regent. He would be an absolute monarch. L'État, c'est moi, he declared. I am the state. From that moment on, every decision in France would go through Louis XIV. He was not just a king, he was France. But Louis had a problem. The French nobility still posed a threat. They had vast armies on their estates. They controlled regions of France almost like independent kingdoms. They had tried to overthrow him once during the Fronde. What would stop them from trying again? Louis needed a solution, and he found it in a small, unremarkable hunting lodge located about 12 miles southwest of Paris, a place called Versailles. The vision, turning a swamp into a paradise. Versailles was nothing special. It was a small brick and stone chateau that Louis XIII had built as a hunting retreat. It sat in the middle of marshland surrounded by forests and swamps. Mosquitoes bred in the stagnant water. The air smelled of decay. It was the last place anyone would want to live. But Louis saw something different. He saw potential. He saw a blank canvas. He saw a way to build something so magnificent, so overwhelming, so impossibly luxurious that it would become the center of the world. In 1661, Louis began transforming Versailles, but this was not a simple renovation. This was the most ambitious construction project in European history. Louis hired the best architects, engineers, and artists in France. The architect Louis Laveau would design the palace. The landscape architect André Le Nôtre would design the gardens. The painter Charles Lebrun would decorate the interiors. And thousands of workers, soldiers, and even prisoners would labor for decades to make Louis's vision a reality. But why Versailles? Why not just expand the Louvre in Paris, the traditional royal residence? Because Louis had a plan, a brilliant, ruthless, strategic plan. He was going to move the entire French government and the entire French nobility out of Paris and into Versailles. He was going to create a palace so large that it could house thousands of people. And once the nobility moved to Versailles, Louis would have them exactly where he wanted them, under his constant watch. Construction began immediately, but the challenges were enormous. The land was swampy, so workers had to drain the marshes and build foundations on unstable ground. There was no natural water source, so engineers had to design elaborate systems of pumps and aqueducts to bring water from miles away. The gardens alone required enough water to supply a city of 20,000 people. Thousands of workers died during construction, victims of disease, accidents, and exhaustion. But Louis didn't care. He wanted perfection, no matter the cost. Year after year, Versailles grew. Wings were added. Galleries were built. The famous Hall of Mirrors, a breathtaking corridor lined with 357 mirrors and overlooking the gardens, was constructed. At a time when mirrors were incredibly expensive luxuries, Louis filled an entire hall with them just to show his wealth and power. Gold was everywhere. Gold leaf covered the gates, the furniture, the ceilings, the walls. Crystal chandeliers hung from every room. Marble floors stretched for acres. The palace became a symbol of Louis's absolute power. But the gardens were even more impressive. André Lenotre designed 2,000 acres of perfectly manicured gardens with geometric patterns, fountains, sculptures, and tree-lined paths. There were over 1,400 fountains and 400 sculptures. The fountains alone were an engineering marvel. Remember, this was the 17th century. There were no electric pumps. Everything was powered by complex hydraulic systems. And even then, there was never enough water to run all the fountains at once, so servants would run ahead of Louis during his walks and turn on the fountains just before he arrived, then turn them off after he passed. By 1682, after more than 20 years of construction, Louis XIV officially moved the royal court from Paris to Versailles. The palace was not finished. It would continue to be expanded and renovated for decades, but it was ready to serve its purpose. And that purpose was control. The Golden Cage: How Versailles Became a Prison. Here is where the story takes a fascinating and dark turn. Louis XIV did not build Versailles just to show off his wealth. He built it as a trap. A golden, luxurious, irresistible trap for the French nobility, and they walked right into it. Before Versailles, the French nobles lived on their estates across France. They had their own armies, they controlled their own lands, they were powerful and independent. This made them dangerous to the king, but Louis had a solution: invite them all to live at Versailles. Make it the center of power. Make it the only place where important decisions were made. Make it so that if a noble wanted any influence, access to the king, or any political power, they had to be at Versailles. And it worked. Nobles abandoned their estates and moved to Versailles. But here's the catch. Once they arrived, they became completely dependent on Louis. Life at Versailles was insanely expensive. Nobles had to dress in the finest clothes, host elaborate dinners, gamble at the king's card tables, and maintain appearances. Many went bankrupt trying to keep up, and if they ran out of money, they had to beg Louis for pensions and titles to survive. Even worse, Louis created an elaborate system of court etiquette that turned every moment of the day into a ritual centered around him. The king's daily routine, called the lever and coucher, involved dozens of nobles competing for the privilege of helping Louis get dressed in the morning and undressed at night. Imagine this: powerful dukes and princes fighting over who gets to hand the king his shirt. It was humiliating, but it was also strategic. Louis made them feel honored to serve him, and in doing so, he turned warriors into servants. Every aspect of life at Versailles was designed to keep the nobility busy, distracted, and powerless. There were constant parties, balls, hunts, concerts, plays, and gambling sessions. Nobles spent their days gossiping, scheming over who sat closer to the king at dinner, and desperately trying to catch Louis's attention for even a moment. Meanwhile, their estates back home fell into neglect, and their private armies disbanded. Louis XIV had achieved something remarkable. He had turned the most dangerous people in France into pampered, powerless courtiers. They lived in luxury, yes, but they were prisoners. Prisoners in a golden cage, and they didn't even realize it. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a weapon, and Louis wielded it masterfully. For over 50 years, Louis XIV ruled France with absolute power. He fought wars, expanded French territory, and made France the most powerful nation in Europe. He patronized the arts, supported scientists, and made French culture the envy of the world. He was called the Sun King because, like the sun, everything in France revolved around him, and at the center of his universe stood Versailles. But there was a cost, a terrible cost. The construction and maintenance of Versailles drained the French treasury. The constant wars Louis fought to expand his glory cost even more. By the time Louis XIV died in 1715, after ruling for 72 years, the longest reign of any European monarch, France was drowning in debt. The economy was in ruins, the people were suffering, and the stage was set for disaster. But the real tragedy of Versailles was still to come. It would take 3 more generations for the full consequences to reveal themselves, and when they did, it would be in the form of a revolution that would shake the world. The inheritance, a broken kingdom and a child king. When Louis XIV died in 1715, his great-grandson, Louis XV, became king. He was only 5 years old. Once again, France had a child king. Louis XV would eventually grow up and rule for 59 years, but he lacked his great-grandfather's political genius. He was more interested in pleasure than politics. He kept Versailles as the center of power, but he let the government decay. Corruption became rampant. Ministers embezzled money. The nobility, still trapped at Versailles, continued their meaningless rituals while the country crumbled. By the time Louis XV died in 1774, France was in crisis. The treasury was empty, the people were angry, and the monarchy was more out of touch than ever. The new king, Louis XVI, inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse. He was 19 years old, shy, awkward, and completely unprepared to rule. But he had one thing that would make him infamous: his wife, Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was an Austrian princess, the youngest daughter of Empress Maria Theresa. She married Louis XVI when she was only 14 years old as part of a political alliance between France and Austria. She arrived at Versailles with high hopes, but she quickly discovered that life at the French court was suffocating. The rigid etiquette, the constant scrutiny, the endless gossip, it was unbearable. And worse, the French people hated her from the start because she was Austrian. France and Austria had been enemies for centuries, and many French citizens saw Marie Antoinette as a foreign spy. Marie Antoinette tried to escape the oppressive atmosphere of Versailles by creating her own private retreat. She commissioned the construction of the Petit Trianon, a smaller chateau within the Versailles grounds, and then the Hameau de la Reine, a fake peasant village where she could pretend to live a simple life. She dressed as a shepherdess, played with farm animals, and hosted intimate parties with her friends. To her, it was a harmless escape. But to the starving people of France, it was an obscene insult. Because while Marie Antoinette played peasant in her fake village, real peasants across France were dying of starvation. Crop failures and economic mismanagement had caused food shortages. Bread prices skyrocketed. People were desperate. And when they looked toward Versailles, they saw a palace of unimaginable luxury, gold-covered walls, and a queen spending fortunes on dresses, jewelry, and parties. Rumors spread like wildfire. People said Marie Antoinette was bankrupting France with her spending. They called her Madame Deficit. They said she was having affairs. They blamed her for everything wrong with the country. And then came the most famous rumor of all. When told that the people had no bread to eat, Marie Antoinette supposedly said, "Let them eat cake." She never actually said this, it was propaganda, but it didn't matter. The people believed it. In their eyes, Marie Antoinette was a monster, a selfish, frivolous foreigner who cared nothing for their suffering. The truth was more complicated. Marie Antoinette did spend a lot of money, but she was not responsible for France's financial crisis. That was caused by decades of war, corruption, and the enormous cost of maintaining Versailles itself. But Marie Antoinette became the scapegoat. She was an easy target, and as France spiraled toward revolution, the people needed someone to blame. The revolution, when the palace became a target. By 1789, France was on fire. The financial crisis had reached a breaking point. King Louis XVI, desperate for solutions, called a meeting of the Estates General, a representative assembly that hadn't met in 175 years. It included representatives from the clergy, the nobility, and the common people. But when the common people's representatives demanded real power and voting rights, the king refused, and that refusal lit the fuse. On July 14, 1789, an angry mob stormed the Bastille, a royal fortress and prison in Paris. The French Revolution had begun. At first, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette didn't take it seriously. They remained at Versailles, believing that the unrest would pass. But it didn't. The revolution grew stronger. The people demanded the end of the monarchy. They wanted liberty, equality, and fraternity. They wanted revenge for centuries of oppression. On October 5, 1789, something unthinkable happened. A mob of thousands, mostly women, marched from Paris to Versailles. They were armed with pikes, pitchforks, and muskets. They were hungry, they were furious, and they wanted the king and queen. The march took several hours, but when they arrived at the palace gates, they demanded to see the king. Louis XVI, terrified, agreed to meet with them. He promised to provide bread. He tried to calm them, but it wasn't enough. The next morning, the mob broke into the palace. They stormed through the halls, smashing furniture, tearing down tapestries, searching for Marie Antoinette. They wanted to kill her. Marie Antoinette's guards rushed her out of her bedroom just moments before the mob arrived. She ran through secret passages, barefoot and wearing only her nightgown, to reach the king's chambers. The mob found her empty bedroom and tore it apart, screaming for her blood. Eventually, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette appeared on a balcony to address the crowd. The mob demanded that the royal family return to Paris with them. They were no longer safe at Versailles. Louis XVI had no choice. He agreed. On October 6, 1789, the royal family left Versailles forever. They were escorted by the mob back to Paris, where they would become prisoners in the Tuileries Palace. Versailles, the palace that had symbolized absolute power for a century, was abandoned. But the revolution was far from over. Over the next few years, the situation grew worse. Louis XVI was seen as weak and indecisive. Marie Antoinette was despised even more. Revolutionary leaders gained power. The monarchy was abolished. France became a republic, and then the ultimate horror, the executions. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in Paris. Thousands watched as the king's head fell into the basket. 9 months later, on October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette met the same fate. She was 37 years old. The woman who had once been the Queen of Versailles, who had lived in unimaginable luxury, died in front of a bloodthirsty crowd that cheered as her head was severed from her body. And Versailles? It was looted. Furniture was stolen, art was sold. The palace that had taken decades and unimaginable wealth to build was stripped bare in a matter of months. Revolutionaries debated tearing it down entirely. Some wanted to burn it to the ground as a symbol of the old regime. But ultimately, they decided to turn it into a museum, a reminder of the monarchy's excess and the people's triumph. The aftermath: what Versailles became. For decades after the revolution, Versailles stood empty. It was a ghost palace. Tourists would visit to see the ruins of royal power. But in 1833, King Louis Philippe, who ruled France after Napoleon's fall, decided to restore Versailles. He turned it into a museum dedicated to all the glories of France. It was no longer a royal residence. It was a monument to history. Today, the Palace of Versailles is one of the most visited monuments in the world. More than 10 million people visit each year. They walk through the Hall of Mirrors, where the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, ending World War I. They stroll through the gardens, admiring the fountains and sculptures. They tour Marie Antoinette's private hamlet, where she once pretended to be a peasant, and they marvel at the sheer extravagance of it all. But the palace holds secrets. dark secrets that most tourists never learn. The hidden secrets of Versailles. First, let's talk about the cost. No one knows exactly how much Versailles cost to build because Louis XIV ordered the financial records destroyed. He didn't want future generations to know how much he had spent. Modern historians estimate that the total cost was between $2 billion and $300 billion in today's money. Think about that, the equivalent of an entire nation's wealth spent on one palace. Second, the death toll. Thousands of workers died during construction. They died from disease, exhaustion, accidents, and the brutal working conditions. The marshland around Versailles bred malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Workers fell from scaffolding. They were crushed by falling stones. But there are no memorials to these workers, no records of their names. They built the palace, and then they were forgotten. Third, the Hall of Mirrors has a hidden purpose. Yes, it's beautiful. Yes, the mirrors were a display of wealth. But Louis XIV also used the hall for psychological warfare. When foreign ambassadors visited, they had to walk the entire length of the hall to reach the king. As they walked, they saw their reflections multiplied infinitely in the mirrors, making them feel small and insignificant. Meanwhile, Louis sat at the far end on his throne, bathed in sunlight from the windows, looking like a god. It was theater. It was power. It was intimidation. Fourth, there are secret passages throughout the palace. Louis XIV and his descendants used them to move around without being seen. Marie Antoinette used them to escape the mob in 1789. Some of these passages are still hidden, undiscovered. Who knows what else is hidden within the walls of Versailles? Fifth, the gardens have a dark secret. Beneath the beautiful fountains and sculptures lies an elaborate network of underground tunnels and reservoirs. Workers would operate the water systems from below ground, invisible to the nobles strolling above. It was like a hidden underworld beneath the paradise. And remember, there was never enough water to run all the fountains at once, so the entire system was essentially a magnificent lie. Appearances over reality. That was Versailles. The legacy. What Versailles teaches us. The story of Versailles is not just about a palace. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power, unchecked wealth, and living in a bubble. Louis XIV built Versailles to control the nobility and cement his power. It worked for a while, but it also set the stage for disaster. By isolating the monarchy at Versailles, by creating a culture of luxury and excess, by ignoring the suffering of ordinary people, the French kings sealed their own fate. Marie Antoinette became the symbol of everything wrong with Versailles. She was not evil, she was not the monster that revolutionaries made her out to be, but she was oblivious. She lived in a golden bubble surrounded by luxury while the country burned, and when the people finally had enough, they came for her. Today, when people visit Versailles, they see beauty, they see art and architecture and history, but they should also see a warning. Versailles is a monument to what happens when leaders lose touch with the people they govern. It is a reminder that no amount of gold, no amount of luxury, no amount of power can protect you if you forget the needs of ordinary people. The palace still stands, over 300 years after Louis XIV moved the court there, over 200 years after the revolution destroyed the monarchy. Versailles endures, but it no longer represents power, it represents a lesson carved in gold and marble, a lesson written in the blood of a king and queen who paid the ultimate price for living in a palace while their people starved. The palace that changed the world. Versailles influenced the world in ways most people never realize. After Louis XIV built it, every European monarch wanted their own version. The Habsburgs built Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. The Romanovs built Peterhof Palace in Russia. Frederick the Great built Sanssouci in Prussia. Even the White House in America was influenced by French palace design. Versailles set the standard for royal architecture for centuries. But Versailles also represents something darker. It represents the ultimate expression of inequality. While nobles danced in the Hall of Mirrors, peasants starved in the countryside. While the king spent fortunes on fountains, soldiers died in pointless wars. While Marie Antoinette played shepherdess in her fake village, real shepherds struggled to survive. This disconnect between the rulers and the ruled led directly to the French Revolution, and the French Revolution inspired revolutions around the world. The American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Latin American Wars of Independence, all were influenced by the ideas that exploded out of France in 1789. In a very real sense, the modern world was born from the ashes of Versailles. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that revolutionaries fought for became the foundation of modern democracy. The execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette sent shockwaves across Europe. It proved that kings were not chosen by God. They were not untouchable. They could be held accountable. They could be overthrown. This was a radical, world-changing idea. And it all started because a king built a palace that was too beautiful, too expensive, too disconnected from reality. Versailles was Louis XIV's greatest achievement and his greatest mistake. It gave him absolute power, but it also planted the seeds of the monarchy's destruction. Versailles today, a living museum. Today, you can walk through Versailles and see the same rooms where Louis XIV held court. You can stand in the Hall of Mirrors, where the Treaty of Versailles was signed, officially ending World War I and redrawing the map of Europe. You can visit Marie Antoinette's bedroom, still decorated as it was the morning she fled for her life. You can stroll through the gardens where nobles once gossiped and schemed. But as you walk through these spaces, remember what they represent. Remember the thousands of workers who died building them. Remember the peasants who starved while nobles feasted. Remember the king and queen who lost their heads because they forgot that power without responsibility leads to revolution. The Palace of Versailles is a masterpiece. There is no denying its beauty. The artistry, the craftsmanship, the sheer ambition of it all is breathtaking. But it is also a monument to excess, to inequality, to the dangerous illusion that leaders can separate themselves from the people and survive. When visitors take photos in the Hall of Mirrors, when they admire the golden gates, when they marvel at the fountains, they are standing in the same place where history turned, where absolute monarchy reached its peak and then collapsed, where the old world ended and the new world began. And that is the true legacy of Versailles. It is not just a palace, it is a turning point in human history. It is proof that no matter how much power you accumulate, no matter how much wealth you display, no matter how magnificent your palace, if you lose touch with the people, if you ignore their suffering, if you value appearances over reality, you will fall. Louis XIV once said, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state. But he was wrong. The state is the people. And when the people have had enough, palaces fall, crowns shatter, and even the mightiest kings become nothing more than cautionary tales. The Palace of Versailles will live forever, not because of its gold, not because of its mirrors, not because of its beauty. It will live forever because it teaches us the most important lesson in history. Power without compassion leads to destruction. Luxury without justice leads to revolution, and no palace, no matter how magnificent, can protect you from the consequences of forgetting that we are all human. This is the story of Versailles, a golden prison that destroyed a kingdom, a monument to excess that sparked a revolution, a masterpiece that cost everything, and a warning that echoes through the centuries. Remember the people, or the people will remember you. And that, my friends, is why the Palace of Versailles stands as both the most beautiful and the most haunting monument in the world.